I've drawn up my still life in a jug, and I'm going to put down some pale colour first, just as a base. I'm going to start with the jug itself. So again, with the style that I normally use, we build up in our layers and tones of colour, but this time I'm going to be employing some other techniques just to give a little bit more texture as I go along. So just roughly block in some quite loose pale colours. So in this case I'm doing the beige sort of tones. I'll do those first. Not worried about the colour bleeding in just a touch, that's fine. So when this is dry, completely dry, I'm going to get a sponge or a little sponge pad like this, or it could just be an ordinary little piece of sponge that you've cut up from a washing up pad or something, and we're going to dab into the paint and actually add some texture. It's important that the base layer is quite dry so that this new texture sits on top. So that will do for that. Now that's the light side of the jug, this is the darker side. So now I'm going to wait for that to dry. I'm going to do a similar thing with the mantelpiece that it's on. It's actually a cast iron mantelpiece. It's quite dark, which will be useful when we're doing the feather, the light feather on the other side. It's nice for the jug to sit against something. So I'm going around the jug to create the top edge of the mantelpiece and just creating a pale wash. Now we're going to add some texture to the mantelpiece, which has got like rusty sort of marks on it, so that will be of reddish tinges here. So I'm just going to put some rust coloured paint on here just to give that feeling of some texture there. You have to be careful of the edges, because it kind of, if you're using a shaped sponge, just try not to make it look as though you've got regular marks on it. And just keep going until you've got a nice texture on the mantelpiece. So not everything is going to have texture on it. I thought the jug should, because it's a earthenware, and the mantelpiece because it's got this rust texture. So just be sparing about where you use your texture, otherwise it won't have any impact. Continue to build up the image with as you would normally do with your watercolour. So putting some nice base colours down first. I'm starting with the rusty beigey coloured things first. So that goes for the seed head. So try and create a nice soft effect with your paints, as opposed to a poster solid look. We want things to be nice and translucent for this style. So get your base colours down, make sure there's a variation in colour rather than just using a mix of one. Try to keep varying the colour tones. So when it comes to something like the teasel, it's quite tricky because it's got all these little spines which come out of it. So as with anything else, you choose a light and a dark side. Just decide very strongly in your mind where the light's coming from, and that will help to give form. So there's not really a clear side here, but I'm going to make it the right hand side that's the lightest. Okay, so that's like the first part of the texture of this one. That will need to dry now before I go back in again to that, using the similar colour for the other one. Probably need a larger brush. So the essence of this exercise is really a light touch with your watercolour and trying to introduce more texture than we would normally. So look at contrasting textures, and when you're putting your still life together, think about how one thing contrasts against another. So you've got like something quite hard here with the seed head against a soft feather. I think about how things contrast and sit against each other. So work through doing a nice soft washy backdrop and then waiting for that to dry and then adding more as it dries and building up. So now this background base colour is dried, and we're going to look at how to introduce a little bit more texture. So you can do this in a number of ways. You can even introduce other media. I've got some pencils here, pastel pencils, which aren't as messy as traditional pastels. So if you'd like to try something like that, you shouldn't get into a mess with it, and it won't really form a heck of a lot of dust or anything, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. So we could try to create some texture in other areas now. So we have a seed head here, so I could very gently put in the darker areas of the pieces between the little pointy bits of the seeds here. So I think what we're trying to get at is variety of texture alongside the watercolour. Okay, so try and mix it up a little bit because the contrasts will be nice. And then what we can do is go back to some very fine brush work on the feathers, and to define our image sort of further down the line with some very fine line work. So again, this is so it'll be quite coarse, you see, on the watercolour paper, but it's nice to have a little bit of contrast. This can be fixed with either hairspray or proper fixative. So, you know, don't be tempted to blow it and get dust everywhere. Not that you can see there's not any dust really being created. So it's quite a nice way of using pastels without getting messy. These are Derwent pastels, pencils. We could use ordinary pencils. You can see that I didn't pay a lot in sale. You can smudge, but I don't like a lot of smudging. But if you smudge, you're going to lose definition. So just to show you, I'm just going to soften it out. Okay. And you can still go back in with your watercolour as well. Okay, so that's that idea. Because the it's quite coarse, the base of the teasels, so that it represents the texture quite nicely. Just that's what you need to think of, representing textures, using your watercolour as a base. Just adding a little bit more depth of colour now. And it doesn't interfere with the textured pastel that I've put on previously. which is good. So I'm just going to keep on working up these areas of texture section by section, just as I'm enjoying the painting process, just doing it as I want to. The area's gone a little bit flat there, so what will happen is I'll have to dry that and then go back in again to make a bit more texture. It's stages by stages, really. Okay, similarly now I'm going to need to go back to this teasel, use some similar colours. So the important thing with the teasels is you just don't want any of the areas to look too flat whilst giving form. And just remember that light and dark side. I love teasels, but they're actually quite hard to paint. So you're actually painting the shadows, really. Just think of it as painting the little dark shadows in between. Okay, that's probably enough of that, and I would need to go back to that. So now I can go to perhaps working on feather a little bit. Finer brush. This is the fun part. Actually getting all these little So I'm just going to add a little bit more texture to some areas again here. I've got tiny sponge here, and I'm just going to add a little bit of texture to the front of this. Seed head. It's gone in a bit heavy, so do not panic. Just get a tissue and lift that out a little bit. Create a bit more texture like that. So it's easy to tidy things up. If you use a tissue just to pull out the paint if it goes on a bit heavy. So again here I need to add a bit more form to this. So I'm just going in with a dry brush, quite dry brush, and the edge of the brush just to create some kind of edges, just to suggest how this seed head sticks. Little pointy bits that stick out, like a thistle. Again, if there's anything that seems too heavy, just blot out a little bit. And you can tidy up with a fine brush. Everything's going to be tidied up with a fine brush at the end, so don't panic on it. Just need a little bit of colour at the top here. So we're getting towards the end where we just need to go around edges and refine things. Just need to put some green, the green of the leaves in on this berry area here on the right hand side. It's the only bit of green on it. Getting the green right. Just adds a nice little contrast to it, having a little bit of green in there. Otherwise everything's quite brown. You could actually exaggerate the red as well of the stalk of this berry here. All of these things found in the garden, so see what you can find left over in your garden.